Hello, I'm Richard Vobes, the Bald Explorer, and I'm continuing with my look at early fields, the field systems of England. And I've been working from Fields in the English Landscape by Christopher Taylor. Now, we've looked at the Neolithic fields, we looked at the Roman fields in this little series, and then the Saxon fields. And now it's time to get to the point where I suppose between 900 and 1200, before the Normans came in and then when the Normans were in. So nothing drastic happened in terms of the field layout when the Normans came in 1066. So this is the early medieval open fields that we're going to be looking about. It's quite complex, really, so I'm hoping that I can get this across, because I'm regurgitating the knowledge that I've got to you to help me get it into my head. It's just how I find the easiest way for me to learn. So most people have the general idea that of open fields, that they tend to think of after the Norman conquest that each village was surrounded by 2 or 3 large open fields, unhedged, that were divided into a multitude of strips, individually owned but farmed in common. And that's the sort of simplistic version of it. Now, I'm working from some notes, just so you know. That's why I'm looking down at them. Now, in reality, of course, this was much more complicated than this, and the system had evolved over time, and it varied across the country, and it wasn't everywhere. There were 4 elements really to make the open field system, the true open field system, work. And these were as follows. Firstly, arable land was divided into strips, which was owned or tenanted, because you had lords of the manor and things, by various people who farmed a number of these strips, which were scattered all over the land. And these are narrow strips. These are narrow strips separate right next to each other. So these open fields were big, large fields with these strips. So an individual might own a bit down here, might own another bit up there, and might own another one over there. And the soil would vary in the landscape naturally, and so that's why you had people owning different strips, because it was fair that everybody had some good soil and everybody had bits of worse soil, as it were. So that was the first thing. The second thing was that both arable and meadowland were pastured by the stock, i.e. sheep and cattle, that they had by the same farmers, both after the harvest and in the fallow years. So some of these strips were, now I don't know how this was worked, because they say they weren't hedged, but some of this area, and maybe they used hurdles of some description, that the strips, some strips that might have been still growing crops, were next to other strips that were not growing crops, that they were fallow, or had potentially got a crop that was there purely to grow for the sheep or the cattle to eat. And so they were allowed to go onto these strips. Now, of course, this would mean that you had very strict rules governing where they could go, what was sown on the land, and how many animals could actually be allowed onto that land, because animals need quite a bit of land to be able to feed themselves, and you don't want too many animals coming in and suddenly you've got no more food for those animals to survive the year on. So strict rules and numbers for the stock animals of where they could graze was part of it. And finally, in order to make this work, the 4th point was that the rules and activities that governed all of this had to be organised by formal meetings, either at the manorial court or at village assemblies. And I think this is the most interesting and important part about this open field system. We can think, yeah, they had strips and they just toddled off and did whatever they did, for subsistent farming. But actually, all of this had to be under some organisation, some control. Hence, your lord of the manor being very much part of that, and his stewards and people like that, making sure that people adhered to what was agreed in common, so that you weren't growing tons of different things, that you were all growing similar things to make this work for your community. So these are important things. Now, the classic system, as described there, was very much prevalent in the Midlands of the country. Now, I don't know whether that's because it's flatter land, or there was something about that it seemed to work better, or the soil was better, or the climate was more temperate or something, but that seems to be where it was, and it sort of reached its zenith, as it were, around about the 12th century. So prior to that, probably not so organised, not so ubiquitous. The whole system, however, was a lot more complex and varied than what I've just painted, as you can see. So there's a number of factors that come into how the landscape was farmed, even within this three-field system. And I hope this is not going to get bogged down too much. So people have got these strips, and you've got this large swathe of landscape, which is a field. And you've got one, say, this side, one that side, and potentially another one behind you or wherever. And within those great big areas, there are individual farmers farming and owning or tenanting certain strips. Certain numbers of these strips next to each other, whether owned by one person or several people, could well be growing one particular crop. And those would then become a furlong. And they may be part of a rotation system within this one field. So you may have 3 or 4 strips as one block or a furlong. Then you may have another 3 or 4 strips owned by either some of the same people or different people or one person. And that may be in fallow. That may be growing nothing, so that the soil can recover. Or you may be having a spring crop on one furlong, you may have a winter crop coming up on another furlong, and another block in fallow. But that may not be the whole of the land, so you may have this rotation system working, but you may also have another rotation system with other strips blocked up into furlongs doing a different thing. Or you may have a spring crop here at 3 or 4 strips, and another spring crop over there doing 3 or 4, all part of this one field. So the whole organisation of this was incredibly complicated, but probably to them, because it was their way of life, that once you'd organised it, it was a simple thing, but it seems very complicated. Now, so you've got that happening with all of this, mainly around in the Midlands, but in other parts of the country this system may be working, but it may have completely varied, and there's reasons why the variations of this. For example, the principal reason is, of course, that many of these fields originated obviously much earlier, say in the Neolithic times, and then you had the Romans came in and changed them a little bit, but not much, and the Saxons came in, changed them a little bit and not much. So not much had changed, but you had existing field systems which in different parts of the country just wasn't so amenable to this open field system, or didn't really change back to this system so quickly. So that was one thing. And of course, England, as we all know, has a varying climate. And the geology means that the soil quality changes from place to place. The topography is all over the place with hills and mountains or near mountains, and valleys and so forth. So you've got all of that, the slopes. And of course, some areas are going to have springs and are going to be closer to water or rivers, so irrigation is more possible. So all of these things change how every part of the land was ever farmed. And of course, with all of those things, you're going to have certain crops which are going to grow better in certain parts of the land. If you've got a warmer area or it's more south facing, that sort of thing, that's going to tell you what crops are going to be better over in this part of the country, what crops fare over here, what bits are better for pasture or for grazing, that sort of thing. So huge amount of variation. So when we think of the open field systems, we've got to be aware that actually that's not carte blanche everywhere, and each one had variations of it, but so much depended on so much else. Within all of that, of course, presumably you would still have had over time the individual farmsteads with families who had their own separate fields, still in the old system, the block fields, pretty much like we have today, really, on the smaller farms, where you've got your square fields and a homestead and a farm, and just one family, a growing family, farming their own food for subsistence, principally. Other things that would have changed over time and moved us away from this purely subsistence farming was a whole load of other things, such as the social factor. For example, this is where the land, whether that's in strips or fields or farms or even whole estates, how that was passed on from generation to generation, and that's going to change. So for example, somebody may own various strips here and here, or a whole farm, and they may have to divide that when they die to their sons. Or the custom may be that you don't divide it to all of your sons, but only to the eldest son. And that may, or indeed, you may not have any sons, you may only have daughters. So that may change things. And indeed, if you didn't have any and you died prematurely, let's say, before children came in, then that land may go back to the lord of the manor, or it may be goes to the wife, who then chooses another husband, and so you get into all of that complicated social things of how the land was farmed and by whom, and all of that. Economic considerations would also have to thought about. The changes, for example, in the demand of agricultural products. So, in other words, as the population was growing, it may be in certain areas you needed to grow more crops because that was a better way of feeding people, and you would reduce the amount of grazing and pasture, so your sheep and cattle, and indeed pigs. You may have to reduce that. Alternatively, in times where the population was going down to droughts, starvation, plague, illnesses, or people just moving out of that area, then certain parts of the landscape would be abandoned, and those strips perhaps would be sold on to another person, or left, or turned into scrub. So all of that system was changing over periods of time. Urban centres, of course, were growing up. So villages that had grown into towns, towns that had grown into cities. Not everybody there is farmers, of course. You've got new professions coming in, so subsistence farming had changed. And you started to get market farming. People needed food. The farms would have a surplus. They could send that food to the cities and towns. And so all of this would be changing how the landscape was changing over all this over this time in the medieval period. So, to sum up this bit then, by the early 14th century, over much of England, pretty much, was some form of strip field cultivation, varied but highly organised. And so before I end this section, because there's more to say, we just look at how, and this is what got me really into the whole thing about understanding this, was when I read in a different book about how we think of villages having, once the Saxons had settled and the Romans had gone, that villages pretty much evolved from when the Saxons came in. They settled down, and that's where our villages came about. And then I read that that wasn't so, although there are some villages that have sprung from that, but generally not the case. And that between 900 and 1200, the villages, there was a point where a drastic change happened. And this is really it. This is it. The last episode we talked about Saxons and how they had lots of farmsteads, and pretty much all of England was cultivated, and subsistence farming was going about, with a little bit of surplus being swapped and sold and perhaps going overseas and things like that, and towns just beginning. But as we get up to about 900 and before the Normans come in, we see that there was a drastic change, and there was a decision, probably by lords of the manor, probably by larger landowners who had accumulated land before the Normans came in, and the decision was that we had to, as population was growing, you had to change the way we did things. This took time. It wasn't like, 1 year somebody came up with it and it was carte blanche across the country. This took 200-300 years to come about as the idea progressed and developed. But what basically happened, all these farmsteads with their own individual land was amalgamated, and so the farmsteads were encouraged to move to a nucleus. So whether that be around a village green, where you would have the domestic parts of the living, or along, like in a ribbon development where you have houses all strung along a road, and the fields that once were peppered with these individual farmsteads were now, the farmsteads had gone, and we had these big unhedged open fields that the nucleus, the village, the nucleated village, would be farming in accordance with their organisation, which had been inspired by or ordered by the lord of the manor or the village assemblies or whatever. And so between 900 and 1200 there was this definite shift from individual farm subsistence farming to this communal farming for the village. And then once you've got that village established, you started to see the individual professions that were then servicing the village, the blacksmiths, the candlestick makers, and so the bakers, and all of these things, which now were helping one another. And you get the beginning of what we now see in the landscape, the villages and the towns at that early developing point. So it's absolutely fascinating. I absolutely love it. I hope that has been interesting and that I have somehow managed to get that across clearly, but this is how I interpreted it from this remarkable and slim but fascinating book by Christopher Taylor, who was a field archaeologist in the 1970s. Anyway, I will do more of these if you're interested, but in the meantime, thank you so much for watching. I hope I put it across all right, and I will see you next time. Don't forget to follow, like and subscribe, become a patron, support what I do, give me a thumbs up if you've enjoyed it, and I'll see you next time. Thanks for watching. Bye-bye.